your book, Team of Teams, you emphasize the importance of agile, decentralized decision making, which I think, as you mentioned earlier, is not as easy to be done, easily said, perhaps difficult to do. How can leaders in corporate settings implement this approach effectively? And would you have an example where you have seen it done well?
Yeah. I would say first, when we talk about agile decentralized leadership, the two are pretty close because you need to decentralize to get fast enough.
Mhm.
The problem is if you decentralize leadership across your organization, usually it's not coordinated enough. So you're not all contributing to the same outcome. And it is often not informed by the real situation. In the military, we call it a common operating picture. In the book, Team of Teams, we refer to it as shared consciousness. You go back to the blind men and the elephant, the story of the five blind men, and one sees the tail, one sees the trunk. And they aren't incorrect in their description. They are describing what they have touched. But none of them are correct about the elephant. And yet the problem is almost always the elephant. And so the challenge of this is not telling people at the lowest level to make decisions, because you can do that and then go off to the golf course. The problem is they will all act on their narrow perspective with their narrow capabilities. So the art is having everybody have this shared consciousness, this common understanding, and operating towards a common goal with a unified strategy. So here's this tension point.
Yes.
Traditionally, armies, which wanted to have mass, they wanted to get their bulk of their forces to attack the enemy at a point of weakness all together at the same moment, had to get people lined up shoulder to shoulder, had to have huge discipline, because otherwise you couldn't get everybody at the right spot at the right time. Of course, you give up tremendous amount of agility, you give up tremendous amount of initiative to achieve that. And for years, that was the trade-off. In fact, to a great degree, it still is the trade-off. So what we are trying to do now is to leverage technology, to leverage training of junior leaders, so that you can connect people using this miracle of modern information technology to give them this constant awareness, have an ability to constantly shape what they are doing and adjust it to what's happening maybe hundreds of miles from where they are, and to make the relevantly correct decision. During the Apollo program, where the United States put the man on the moon in 1969, the guy they put in charge was a systems engineer. And what he did was there were 80 universities, there were hundreds of thousands of people involved, all spread out geographically. He connected them with a big radio link, because every time you changed one part of this program, it affected every other part of the program. So and there was no internet. So they communicated constantly, so that if I added a pound of weight here, somebody else knew, that's an issue, I got to do that. It's that discipline. And this gets back to decentralized agility requires extraordinary discipline. And people say, now, wait a minute, those two are in opposition. They are not. You are disciplined to stay focused on the strategy, disciplined to follow the need to communicate to where they are. And this is where I think people sometimes get confused. There was an idea that came out a decade ago, holacracy, and it basically says, let everybody in the organization do what they think is best. And to my mind, that's just chaos.
I agree. How do you find the right balance between the two? You certainly want to give your people space where they can be creative and innovative and kind of add to this agility, but in the same time, you don't want to create this chaos where everyone now decides that actually my day job is no longer what I want to do here. I want to go and do something entirely different. So how do we find the balance so we can still inspire people to be fully vested into it, have their heart in it, in the same time they contribute to the common goal?
Yeah, it is a constant effort, because the conditions change every single day. And so it's like a sailing ship. You can't leave the sails and the rudder the same way. It's got to be constantly adjusted to sea state and all the different things with the wind and whatnot. So you are sailing an organization now, and it takes constant attention, and everybody's got to be adjusting things as they go. HMS Victory, Admiral Nelson's flagship, had 850 soldiers or sailors, and they had to constantly be doing their job, all coordinated, but doing their job individually to get that thing right. And so if you think of your organization that way, you can't have an annual planning process in January, put out a plan, and then expect everybody to follow that, because the conditions change. I think in the modern environment, you need to have a much more organic system of much more frequent adjustments to what you're doing, constant communication. I also like to term it in terms of variables and constants. Certain things need to be constant. The training of your people needs to be, you have to have a level of competence. You have to have a level of values and culture that you have to be able to count on. What people are committed to, what they won't do, in terms of legal or moral and whatnot. So you have a number of constants that are a foundation. And then the things above that are variables that must constantly be adjusted. But if you can't count on that bedrock foundation, then you got a real problem.
I remember in your book, Team of Teams, you were mentioning Admiral Nelson, and after his death at the Battle of Trafalgar, that you mentioned that the entire British fleet was consisting of captains who were the Admiral Nelson in the way they approached the battle. So how do we achieve this in the modern management? How do we get to a point where, as you're describing it, the approach, the methodology is so clear that not just the top leader, but every leader across the organization is so clear on the way to go? Would you have any good recommendations for our leaders out there?
Yeah, it's a few facts first. The French and Spanish fleet that Admiral Nelson defeated at the Battle of Trafalgar, the captains of those ships were competent, but they were typically upper class or lower nobility leaders. The British captains had grown up at sea. Many of them had gone to sea at age 12 and had worked their way up as midshipmen through. So they were masters of their craft in terms of technically and tactically competent. They were also kind of middle class people. And that's important because the way it worked was, if you captured an enemy ship, the crew of the ship that captured it got the prize money, with the largest part going to the captain and then down. So that was the captain's retirement account. So they were incentivized to capture ships. They were trained through this. They'd grown up in it. Now, after the Battle of Trafalgar, the number of seamen in Admiral Nelson's fleet that were whipped, flogged for petty offenses stayed high. And you say, now, wait a minute, they just had this great victory, a very loyal thing. The point I make is the level of discipline that was accepted by the crews, they just accept that as way of life, was a constant. There was an absolute understanding that this is the way this ship's going to operate, and you will not violate that. At the captain level, he viewed them as the entrepreneurs of battle. And what he sought to do was create a situation where those entrepreneurs, with the understanding that they had competent crews that they could count on, they could then go outside the norm and they could exercise initiative. And it gave an ability for the British Navy to thrive in the kind of wild melee that the Battle of Trafalgar and some of the others turned into.